There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. A knock on the door, a ringing phone, a casual question. They wear the camouflage of the everyday, and it is only in retrospect, when you trace the timeline of your own heart back to its point of fracture and reconfiguration, that you see them for what they were, the quiet hinges upon which your entire world turned. For me, that moment arrived at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday, carried on a gust of damp autumn air and announced by 3 soft, hesitant knocks that were entirely out of place in the aggressive, anonymous rhythm of my apartment building. It was the kind of knock that apologizes for its own existence. I knew, with a certainty that was as immediate as it was illogical, that it was him. I had been awake, of course. My nights were a country I often visited alone, a landscape of blue light from my monitor and the silent, patient company of my own thoughts. I was a photographer, and my mind worked like a darkroom, slowly developing the images of the day, searching for meaning in the interplay of light and shadow. That night, I was editing a series of architectural shots, all clean lines and stark contrasts, a world of beautiful but empty spaces. The knock was a disruption, a sudden, organic presence in my sterile, ordered solitude. I remember the weight of the silence that followed it, a pocket of stillness where I held my breath and waited, my heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. It was too late for a friendly visit and too early for an emergency. It was the hour of bad news or terrible decisions, and I felt a cold dread mix with an even colder, more treacherous flicker of hope. When I opened the door, he was standing there, looking like a ship that had been torn from its moorings and tossed by a storm I knew nothing about. Julian. His shoulders were slumped forward. The usual easy confidence he wore like a second skin was gone, leaving him looking younger and startlingly vulnerable. His hair, usually artfully messy, was just messy, flattened in places as if he'd been resting his head against a window. He had on a hoodie I recognized, one he'd had since college, and his hands were shoved deep into its front pocket. He wasn't looking at me, but at his own worn sneakers, as if they held the answer to a question he was afraid to ask. The hallway light cast a severe, unflattering glow over him, carving new, unfamiliar hollows into his face. He looked lost, not just geographically lost, but fundamentally, existentially lost, a man who had misplaced his own map. He finally lifted his head, and his eyes, usually so bright with quick humor and intelligence, were clouded over, exhausted. "Hey," he said, his voice a low rasp, barely disturbing the air between us. And then, the words that would become the first stone in the foundation of a new world, laid so quietly I almost missed their significance. "Sorry, I know it's late. I thought you'd be awake." I was always awake for him. That was the unspoken truth of our friendship, a service I provided without ever naming it. I was the constant, the fixed point he could navigate by when his own world was in flux. I was the listener, the observer, the keeper of his stories. And in that moment, with the vast, sleeping city breathing around us, I did the only thing I knew how to do. I stepped back, opened the door wider, and let the storm inside. It was a simple gesture, an invitation into the quiet harbor of my apartment, but it felt like a monumental decision. It felt like consent. I was letting him in, not just into my home, but into the fragile, carefully guarded territory of my hope, a place I had long ago learned was too dangerous to let anyone visit, especially him. Our friendship had been built on a foundation of shared history and comfortable, platonic distance. We met in a sophomore-level art history class, a general education requirement we had both put off for as long as possible. I was there because I was an art student, dutifully slogging through the academic side of my passion. Julian was there because, as a burgeoning software engineering prodigy, he needed an easy arts credit to offset his brutal schedule of logic and code. He sat next to me on the first day, radiating a kind of restless energy that was the complete antithesis of my own quiet observation. He was all sharp wit and easy charm, the kind of person who collected friends effortlessly, while I collected moments, framing them in my mind. He would lean over and whisper dry, sarcastic comments about the Baroque period, and I would find myself smiling despite my best efforts to remain studiously aloof. He was, even then, breathtakingly beautiful in a way that felt both classic and completely modern. He had the kind of face that seemed engineered for laughter, with lines that crinkled around his eyes when he smiled, which was often. He was tall and lean, with the casual grace of a natural athlete, though his chosen sport was coding until dawn. For me, a photographer, he was a disaster. He was too much light, too much motion. My work, even then, gravitated toward stillness, toward the subtle story told by an empty room or the texture of a peeling wall. Julian was a roaring fire in a quiet library. Looking at him felt like looking directly into the sun. It was dazzling, and it left an afterimage burned onto my retinas. I knew, with the kind of grim certainty that only a deeply romantic and terminally shy 20-year-old can possess, that I was in serious trouble. My affection for him was a seed that planted itself quietly and then grew in the dark, a subterranean root system I kept hidden from everyone, most of all from him. It was a secret garden I tended to in the lonely hours, a place of impossible, painful beauty. I learned to be his friend. It was a role I took on with the same meticulous care I applied to my photography. I learned to frame our interactions, to crop out the longing, to adjust the exposure until all that was visible was easy camaraderie. I became the confidant, the reliable, steady presence. The good guy. It was a form of self-preservation, a way to keep him in my life without shattering the fragile ecosystem of our friendship. I watched him date a succession of bright, vivacious women, each one a perfect, suitable match for his particular brand of sunshine. The longest and most serious of these was Sarah. She was lovely, an aspiring lawyer with a laugh that could fill a room and a sharp, incisive mind that challenged Julian in ways I never could. They were a perfect couple, a set of matching bookends. They made sense. When I was with them, I always felt like I was shooting in black and white while they were living in vibrant, saturated color. I liked Sarah truly. I admired her. But her presence was a constant, physical reminder of the unbridgeable distance between Julian and me. It was the wall against which my secret hopes would inevitably crash. I photographed their engagement party, a task that felt like a special kind of self-flagellation. Through my lens, I watched him look at her with an open, unguarded adoration that I had only ever dreamed of receiving. I framed the shot, focused on the joy in his eyes, and pressed the shutter. I captured their happiness perfectly, a beautiful, painful image of everything I could never have. I developed the photos, printed them, and gave them the album as a gift, a curated collection of my own heartbreak. My apartment became a neutral territory, a Switzerland in the geography of our lives. It was quiet, minimalist, filled with books and prints and the smell of darkroom chemicals. It was a reflection of me. Julian would come over to escape the happy chaos of his own life, to decompress. We would order takeout and talk for hours about his work, the impenetrable world of code and algorithms that I found fascinating precisely because it was so alien to my own. He would talk about the pressure, the deadlines, the elegant, frustrating logic of it all. I would listen, offering the occasional question, providing the quiet space he needed to unravel his thoughts. He rarely asked about my inner life. Not out of malice, I think, but because he saw me as I presented myself, solid, uncomplicated, a fixed point of stability. I was the shore, and he was the tide, coming and going as he pleased, and I never let on that with every retreat. He pulled a little piece of me back out to sea with him. My feelings for him became a part of the architecture of my life, a structural element so deeply integrated that I no longer noticed its weight. It was just there, holding everything up and holding me in. The phone call that changed everything came on a Wednesday afternoon, a time of day when the light in my apartment was at its most beautiful, slanting in long, golden shafts, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I was cleaning my lenses, a meditative, almost ritualistic task. The phone buzzed on the wooden table, and Julian's name glowed on the screen. I smiled, expecting a call to complain about a bug in his code or to suggest a last-minute movie. But when I answered, the voice on the other end was hollowed out, a stranger wearing Julian's voice. "It's over," he said, with no preamble. Just those two words, flat and heavy. I didn't need to ask what it was. The silence that followed was filled with the phantom sound of a shared world shattering. Sarah, the wedding they had been planning, the house they were looking at, the future that had been written in stone. it had all been erased. I asked the stupid, necessary questions. What happened? Are you okay? His answers were clipped, monosyllabic. He sounded like he was reporting on a catastrophe from a great distance, emotionally detached from the wreckage. He said he was at a bar near his office. He said he didn't want to go home to his apartment, where her absence would be a physical presence, a ghost in every room. Can I come over? He asked, and the question was so small, so fragile, it almost broke my heart. Of course, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Come over. When he arrived that first night, he looked just as wrecked as he had on the phone. He was still in his work clothes, but his tie was loosened and his shirt was untucked. He looked like he had run all the way from his office. He didn't say much. He sank onto my couch, the one piece of truly comfortable furniture I owned, and just stared at the blank television screen. I made him tea, a chamomile blend I kept for my own anxious nights. He held the mug in both hands, letting the steam warm his face, but he didn't drink it. We sat in silence for a long time, a silence that was different from our usual comfortable quiet. This was a heavy, wounded silence, thick with unspoken pain. Finally, he started to talk. It came out in a torrent, a confused, angry, heartbroken flood of words. He talked about the arguments they had been having, the small fissures that had grown into chasms. He talked about the pressure, the expectations, the suffocating feeling that his life was a track laid out for him that he was compelled to follow, even if he wasn't sure he wanted to go where it led. He wasn't just mourning the loss of Sarah. He was mourning the loss of a future he had thought was certain. He was a man whose entire operating system had crashed. I just listened. I didn't offer advice or platitudes. I just provided the space, the container for his grief. I was the darkroom where he could let his overexposed emotions develop in safety, without judgment. He talked until his voice was raw, until the words ran out, leaving him exhausted and empty. He fell asleep right there on the couch, mid-sentence, his head lolling to the side. I watched him sleep for a long time. The harsh lines of his grief softened, and in repose, he looked like the boy I'd met in college. I felt an overwhelming surge of a feeling I couldn't name. It was more than affection, deeper than pity. It was a fierce, protective tenderness. I wanted to smooth the worry from his brow, to absorb his pain into myself. But I didn't. I just gently took the cold mug of tea from his hands, pulled the thick wool blanket from the back of the armchair, and draped it over him. My fingers brushed against his shoulder, and a jolt went through me, a low-voltage current of forbidden electricity. He stirred, a soft murmur escaping his lips, but he didn't wake. I retreated to my room, leaving the door ajar, and listened to the sound of his breathing, a steady, rhythmic presence in the quiet of my apartment. It was the first night, the beginning of the ritual. It was the night the tide came in and, for the first time, showed no sign of wanting to go back out. That night established a new, unspoken pattern. It was the beginning of the ritual, the creation of a liturgy of grief and comfort that would come to define our lives for the next several months. The late-night knocks became a regular feature of my solitude. They were no longer a surprise. They were an expectation, a punctuation mark at the end of my long, quiet days. Sometimes he would text first, a simple, "You up?" Other times, he would just appear, a ghost at my door, bearing the weight of his unraveled life. He always had the same apology on his lips, the same rationale that was becoming less of an explanation and more of a refrain. He just thought I'd be awake. It was a perfect piece of plausible deniability for both of us. It allowed him to ask for help without having to use the words, and it allowed me to give it without having to acknowledge the devastating hope that was beginning to bloom in the ruins of my carefully constructed defenses. Our evenings fell into a predictable rhythm. He would arrive, shed his shoes and the armor of his day at the door, and collapse onto my couch. The couch became his territory, his sanctuary. He would sink into its soft cushions as if seeking to be absorbed by them, to disappear. I would put on a movie, something quiet and atmospheric, something that didn't demand too much attention. The films were just background noise, a gentle current to carry us through the long, silent stretches. The real narrative was happening in the space between us. It was a story told in inches, in the gradual closing of the physical gap that had always defined our friendship. At first, he would sit at the far end of the couch, maintaining a respectable, friendly distance. He would hug a cushion to his chest like a shield. I would sit at the other end, my body rigid, hyper-aware of his presence. My senses were dialed to an almost painful level of acuity. I was conscious of the subtle scent of his shampoo, a clean, sandalwood fragrance that clung to him. I was aware of the rhythm of his breathing, the way it would deepen and slow as the exhaustion of the day took hold. I was a seismograph, and he was a distant, subtle earthquake, and my entire being was calibrated to register his every tremor. My apartment, once my solitary fortress, was now a shared space, and the air within it was charged with a new, terrifying, and exhilarating electricity. The first time he crossed the invisible line was about 2 weeks into this new routine. We were watching some slow-paced Scandinavian noir film, all snow and long shadows. The dialogue was sparse, the atmosphere heavy. Julian had been quiet all evening, his usual post-breakup torrent of words having slowed to a trickle. He just seemed tired, a deep, soul-level weariness that went beyond lack of sleep. Halfway through the film, I felt a subtle shift in the couch cushions, a slight dip and then a weight against my shoulder. I froze. He had fallen asleep, and his head had slumped sideways, coming to rest in the hollow between my shoulder and my neck. My entire body went rigid. Every muscle tensed. I held my breath, afraid that the simple act of exhaling would wake him, would shatter the moment. His hair was soft against my cheek, and I could feel the warmth of him seeping through my shirt. It was an agony of proximity. He was closer to me than he had ever been, a casual, unconscious intimacy that my body was interpreting as anything but casual. My heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs. I sat there for what felt like hours, a living statue, my arm going numb, my neck cramping, but I refused to move. I was terrified of breaking the spell, of reminding him of the boundary he had so innocently crossed. It was a moment of profound and painful irony. The thing I had wanted for years was finally happening, but it was an accident, a byproduct of his exhaustion and grief. It didn't mean anything, and yet it meant everything. It was a crack in the dam, and I could feel the pressure of my long-repressed feelings building behind it, seeking a way out. This became the new normal. He would fall asleep, and his body, in its unconscious wisdom, would seek out the warmth and solidity of mine. His head would find my shoulder. Sometimes his arm would drape across my lap, his hand resting, open and trusting, on my thigh. Each time it happened, my internal world would descend into a state of chaotic, hopeful panic. My mind would race, analyzing every detail. The weight of his hand, the slight twitch of his fingers as he dreamt, the soft, vulnerable sound of his breathing. It was a form of exquisite torture. I was being given a glimpse into a world I desperately wanted to inhabit, but I was only a visitor, and my visa was his unconsciousness. As soon as he woke up, he would pull away, a flicker of confusion in his eyes, sometimes mumbling an apology, and the boundary would be reestablished. He would stretch, run a hand through his hair, and become my friend Julian again, oblivious to the emotional wreckage he left in his wake. I began to live for those moments. The rest of my day became a prelude, a waiting period. I would go through the motions of my life, editing photos, meeting with clients, grocery shopping, but my thoughts were always orbiting around the evening, around the possibility that he would knock on my door. My work began to suffer, or rather, it began to change. I found myself drawn to different subjects. I started a new project, a series of self-portraits, but they weren't really about me. They were about the space around me, the indentation his body left on the couch cushion, the single coffee mug he used left by the sink, the blanket he used draped over the chair. I was trying to photograph his absence, to capture the echo of his presence. My art was becoming a testament to my yearning. One night, he arrived looking worse than ever. A new wave of grief had clearly hit him. He had found a box of old photos while cleaning out a closet, and it had undone him. He didn't talk much, just sat on the couch, his face pale and drawn. I put on a movie, but the usual distraction wasn't working. He was restless, fidgeting with the hem of his sleeve. I could feel his anxiety radiating across the space between us, a palpable, crackling energy. After about an hour of this tense silence, he shifted, turning his whole body toward me. He looked at me, his eyes dark with a misery that seemed bottomless. "Can I? This is going to sound weird," he started, his voice low and hesitant. Can I just lie down? Before I could process the question, he had unfolded his long frame and stretched out on the couch, laying his head in my lap. Time stopped. My world compressed to the point of contact, to the weight of his head on my thighs, the feel of his hair through the thin denim of my jeans. He was staring up at the ceiling, but I knew he wasn't seeing it. He was looking inward, at his own private landscape of pain. I was frozen, my hands hovering in the air, unsure of where to put them. It felt like I was holding something impossibly fragile, a piece of shattered glass that could cut me if I moved the wrong way. He let out a long, shuddering sigh, a sound of such profound weariness that it seemed to be drawn from the very marrow of his bones. And then, without thinking, without allowing my hyper-analytical brain to intervene, I did something I had never done before. I slowly, tentatively, lowered my hand and rested it on his head. I threaded my fingers into his hair. It was as soft as I had imagined. He flinched, just for a second, a tiny, almost imperceptible tensing of his muscles. I almost pulled my hand away, my heart seizing with panic. I had crossed a line. I had misinterpreted everything. But then, just as quickly, he relaxed. He leaned into my touch, a small, almost inaudible sound of contentment escaping his lips. He closed his eyes. I sat there, my hand in his hair, gently stroking, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm that I was sure he could feel. He had not just crossed a boundary. He had invited me to cross it with him. He was awake. He was conscious. And he was letting me touch him, letting me comfort him in a way that was undeniably, terrifyingly intimate. The plausible deniability was gone, evaporated in the warmth of my hand on his head. This was no longer an accident of sleep. This was a choice. His choice. And as I sat there in the flickering blue light of the television, I felt the foundations of my world shift, the old structures of friendship and self-protection groaning under the strain of a new, terrifying, and beautiful weight. The ritual had changed. It was no longer just about his comfort. It was about ours. The night he laid his head in my lap marked a definitive turning point, a quiet recalibration of our entire dynamic. The act of me consciously, intentionally touching him, and him consciously, intentionally accepting it, had dismantled the flimsy architecture of plausible deniability we had been hiding behind. The boundary, once a clear and solid line, had dissolved into a shimmering, uncertain haze. The ritual of our evenings continued, but it was imbued with a new weight, a new significance. The accidental brushes and sleepy slumps were replaced by deliberate, if unspoken, acts of closeness. He would come over, and without preamble, stretch out on the couch, placing his head in my lap as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And I, in turn, would rest my hand on his hair or his shoulder, the initial terror of the gesture replaced by a fragile, tender familiarity. We were building a new language, one spoken not with words, but with pressure and warmth and the quiet grammar of touch. We existed in this strange, liminal space for weeks, a floating world suspended between friendship and something more. It was a place of profound comfort and excruciating tension. My mind was a constant battlefield. One part of me, the hopeful, romantic part, saw these moments as confessions, as the slow, cautious unfurling of a mutual affection. It saw his need for my touch as evidence of a deeper emotional current pulling him toward me. But the other part, the cautious, self-protective part that had been in charge for so long, screamed that I was a fool. It insisted that I was nothing more than a convenient source of comfort, a human weighted blanket for a man grieving his lost love. I was a tool for his healing, and once he was whole again, he would discard me, and I would be left more broken than before. This internal debate was exhausting. I felt like I was living two lives, the serene, calm friend on the outside, and a maelstrom of anxiety and longing on the inside. The crossing, when it finally came, happened on a night that was no different from any other. It was a Thursday, I remember, and a cold rain was lashing against my windows, insulating us from the world outside. Julian had been particularly quiet that evening, a deep melancholy clinging to him like the damp chill in the air. He was lying on the couch, head in my lap, and I was tracing idle patterns on his arm, my fingers moving over the fine hairs there. We were watching an old black and white film, but neither of us was paying attention. The silence in the room was thick and heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a shared silence, a space we had built together. He turned his head slightly, looking up at me. The light from the television cast flickering shadows across his face, making his expression unreadable. His eyes, however, were clear and direct. He held my gaze for a long moment, and I felt that familiar, heart-stopping feeling that the world was holding its breath. "Leo," he said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. "Yeah." I managed my own voice tight. He hesitated, and I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes, a vulnerability that mirrored my own. He was on the edge of a precipice, and I knew, with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty, that he was about to either jump or pull back for good. "I don't think I can go home tonight," he said, the words simple and unadorned. "I don't want to be alone." It wasn't a question, but it hung in the air like one. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was new territory. The couch was one thing, a temporary sanctuary. But my bedroom, my bed, that was the heart of my fortress, the most private space in my solitary world. To invite him in there felt like a final, irrevocable surrender. All the warnings from the cautious part of my brain screamed at me to say no, to maintain that final boundary. I could offer him the couch, a pillow, a blanket. It was the sensible, safe thing to do. It would preserve our friendship, preserve my own fragile heart from the inevitable wreckage. But as I looked down at him, at the raw, undisguised need in his eyes, I found that I couldn't. The risk of losing him by saying no felt, in that moment, infinitely greater than the risk of being hurt by saying yes. I was tired of being safe. I was tired of living in the grayscale of self-protection. For once, I wanted to step into the vibrant, terrifying color, even if it was fleeting. "Okay," I heard myself say, the words soft but firm. "You can stay." The relief that washed over his face was so profound it was almost painful to watch. It was as if a great weight had been lifted from him. He didn't smile, but the tension in his jaw eased, and his eyes softened. The rest of the evening passed in a dreamlike haze. We finished the movie, and the unspoken agreement hung between us. When the credits rolled, I stood up, my movements feeling stiff and strange. "I have a spare toothbrush," I said, the mundane words sounding absurd in the charged atmosphere. He nodded, following me as I led the way to my bedroom. The room was small, dominated by a large queen-sized bed and a wall of bookshelves. My camera equipment was neatly arranged on a set of shelves, my silent, silver-eyed companions. The air was thick with a new kind of tension, an awareness of the intimacy of the space. This wasn't the semi-public arena of the living room. This was my inner sanctum. I gave him a t-shirt and a pair of sweatpants to sleep in, and while he changed in the bathroom, I stood by the bed, my mind racing. I pulled back the covers, smoothed the sheets, my hands trembling slightly. It was a simple domestic act, but it felt loaded with meaning, a preparation for a ceremony whose rites I did not know. When he came out, he looked impossibly soft in my clothes. They were a little too big for him, making him look younger, less formidable. He avoided my eyes, his gaze fixed on the floor. We stood there for a moment in an awkward, humming silence. "Which side?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Doesn't matter," I said, though it mattered immensely. I always slept on the left side, the side closer to the door. It was a habit born of a lifetime of solitude. He moved to the right side, and I took my usual place. We slipped under the covers, the cool sheets a shocking contrast to the heat I felt radiating from my own skin. We lay on our backs, side by side, staring up at the dark ceiling. The space between us felt like a chasm, a vast, empty canyon of unspoken words and unfulfilled desires. We were so close, yet so far apart. I could feel the warmth of his body next to mine, could hear the soft sound of his breathing. It was everything I had ever wanted, and it was the most terrifying moment of my life. After what felt like an eternity, he shifted, turning onto his side to face me. I remained on my back, a statue of fear and hope. In the darkness, I could just make out the shape of him, the silhouette of his shoulders, the glint of faint light in his eyes. "Leo," he whispered again, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't decipher. I turned my head on the pillow to look at him. "Would it be," he started, then stopped, his breath catching. He swallowed hard. "Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The question was a detonation in the quiet of the room. It shattered the silence, shattered the ambiguity, shattered every defense I had ever built. It was a direct, vulnerable, terrifying request. There was no plausible deniability here, no room for misinterpretation. He was asking for permission to cross the final, most sacred boundary. My mind went completely blank. All the internal debates, the fear, the analysis, it all vanished, replaced by a single, overwhelming wave of feeling. It was relief. It was terror. It was a profound, earth-shattering joy. I didn't trust my voice to work, so I just nodded, a small, jerky movement in the dark. It was enough. He moved slowly, cautiously, as if he expected me to bolt. He propped himself up on one elbow, his face hovering above mine. I could feel his breath on my cheek, warm and sweet. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes searching mine in the gloom, asking the question one last time without words. And then, he lowered his head and pressed his lips to mine. It was not a passionate kiss. It was not hungry or demanding. It was a question. It was a confession. It was impossibly soft, tentative, and achingly gentle. It was the kiss of a man who was lost and scared and had finally found a landmark in the dark. It was the kiss of a man discovering a truth about himself in real time. My own lips were clumsy, unpracticed in this new language, but I responded, meeting his gentleness with my own. It lasted only a few seconds, but it contained a lifetime of unspoken longing. When he pulled back, he didn't go far. He rested his forehead against mine, and we just breathed together in the darkness, the space between us no longer a chasm, but a point of connection. The ritual was complete. The crossing had been made. And in the quiet aftermath, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The immediate aftermath of the kiss was a strange and beautiful silence. We lay with our foreheads pressed together, the air thick with the aftershock of what had just happened. It felt as though we had stepped through a door into a new room, and we were both standing there, blinking, letting our eyes adjust to the different light. There was no awkwardness, no regret. There was only a profound sense of peace, a quiet rightness that settled deep in my bones. He didn't pull away. He shifted, moving closer until his body was flush against mine and wrapped an arm around my waist, pulling me into a loose, comfortable embrace. I rested my head in the hollow of his shoulder, a place that felt both thrillingly new and deeply familiar. For the first time in years, the frantic, analytical part of my brain was silent. There was nothing to analyze, nothing to interpret. There was only this, the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart against my ear, the feeling of his breath in my hair. We fell asleep like that, tangled together, two separate, lonely coastlines that had finally, improbably, merged. I woke up first, just as the dawn was beginning to bleed gray light into the room. For a disoriented moment, I didn't know where I was. My body was warm, held securely, and the scent of sandalwood was all around me. Then it all came rushing back. The rain, the question, the kiss. Julian was still asleep, his arm draped protectively over me, his face peaceful in the soft light. The lines of worry and grief that had become so familiar were smoothed away, and he looked younger, more serene than I had seen him in months. I lay there, motionless, not wanting to disturb the moment. I studied his face, the dark sweep of his eyelashes against his cheek, the curve of his lips. It felt like a dream I was afraid to wake from. I, the quiet observer, the photographer who lived behind a lens, was finally a part of the scene. I was not capturing the moment. I was in it. And it was more beautiful than any photograph I could ever take. But as the sun rose higher, bringing the world back into sharp, unforgiving focus, the dream began to fray at the edges. A cold dread started to seep into the warmth. What now? What did this mean? Was this a new beginning, or was it a beautiful, catastrophic mistake? My anxiety, which had been so blessedly silent, began to whisper its familiar, poisonous questions. What if he regretted it? What if, in the light of day, he saw this as a moment of weakness, a grief-induced aberration? I was his safe harbor, the friend he could count on. Had I just allowed him to compromise that in a way that would make him feel ashamed, or worse, trapped? The fear was a physical thing, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. Julian stirred, his breathing changing as he drifted toward wakefulness. He mumbled something in his sleep and tightened his grip on me for a moment before his body went slack. His eyes fluttered open. He blinked a few times, a look of soft confusion on his face. He looked at me, and for a split second, I saw the same peaceful recognition from the night before. But then, something shifted. A cloud passed over his eyes. Awareness dawned, and with it came a sudden, sharp panic. He pulled his arm back as if he had been burned. He sat up, scrambling away from me to the far edge of the bed, putting a chasm of cold sheets between us. He wouldn't look at me. He just stared at his hands, his shoulders hunched, his whole body radiating a tense, frantic energy. He started, his voice a rough croak. He cleared his throat. I should go. The words were a punch to the gut. The beautiful, fragile piece of the night shattered into a million pieces. The cautious, cynical part of my brain screamed, I told you so. I felt a flush of shame and hurt so intense it was dizzying. I had been a fool, a naive, hopeful idiot. Julian, I said, my voice barely a whisper. He shook his head, still not looking at me. He stood up, grabbing the clothes he'd worn the day before, which lay in a heap on the floor. He moved with a jerky, panicked haste, a man desperate to escape the scene of a crime. He didn't seem to be able to get out of the room fast enough. I'm sorry, he muttered, the words directed at the floor. I was a mess last night. I shouldn't have. This was a mistake. A mistake. The word landed with the finality of a slammed door. He fled to the bathroom, and I was left sitting in my bed, the warmth of where he had been lying rapidly cooling. I felt hollowed out, a building gutted by fire. All the light and warmth of the night had been a lie, a hallucination. I had allowed myself to believe in something that was never real. I listened to the sound of the shower running, a harsh, percussive sound that felt like it was scouring away every trace of the intimacy we had shared. When he came out, dressed and ready to leave, he was once again the stranger from the hallway, his face a mask of strained neutrality. He couldn't even meet my eyes. I'll text you, he said, already moving toward the front door. It was a lie, and we both knew it. And then he was gone. The click of the lock behind him was the loudest sound I had ever heard. I sat in my silent apartment, the ghost of his presence everywhere, and I felt a loneliness more profound than any I had ever known. The hope that had bloomed so tentatively in the dark had been ripped out by the roots, leaving nothing but a raw, gaping wound. The week that followed was one of the worst of my life. The silence from Julian was absolute. He didn't text. He didn't call. He didn't appear at my door. My apartment, which had become our shared sanctuary, reverted to being my solitary fortress, but now the walls felt like a prison. Every object was a painful reminder. The couch held the ghost of his shape. The mug he used sat on the drying rack, accusing me. My own bed felt vast and empty. I tried to work, but I couldn't focus. The world outside my lens seemed dull and meaningless. The pain of it was a low, constant hum beneath the surface of everything. It wasn't just the rejection that hurt, it was the loss of my friend. In one clumsy, hopeful night, I had lost everything. After 7 days of this agonizing silence, I couldn't take it anymore. The uncertainty was eating me alive. I would rather have a clean, definitive break than this slow, torturous fading away. I needed to know. I needed to hear it from him, face to face. I needed him to look me in the eye and tell me it was a mistake, so I could finally begin the long, arduous process of grieving and moving on. So, with a heart full of dread and a stomach churning with anxiety, I put on my jacket, left my apartment, and walked the 10 blocks to his. I stood outside his door for a long time, my hand raised to knock, unable to complete the motion. This was it. This was the confrontation I had been dreading. Finally, I forced myself to do it. The knock sounded loud and aggressive in the quiet hallway. I heard movement inside, then footsteps. The door opened, and he was there. He looked terrible. He was unshaven, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. He was wearing the same hoodie he had worn the first night he'd shown up at my door. When he saw it was me, the flicker of surprise in his eyes was instantly replaced by a look of weary resignation, like a man who knew an overdue bill had finally come to be collected. "Leo," he said, his voice flat. "Can I come in?" I asked, my own voice surprisingly steady. He hesitated for a moment, then stepped back, letting me pass. His apartment was a mess. Takeout containers were piled on the coffee table, clothes were strewn over chairs. It was the physical manifestation of his internal chaos, a stark contrast to the ordered calm of my own space. He didn't offer me a seat. We just stood in the middle of the living room, 2 feet apart, the air crackling with everything that had been left unsaid. I was the one who broke the silence. "Talk to me, Julian," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "Don't do this. Don't just disappear. After all these years, I deserve more than that." He flinched, but he still wouldn't look at me. He ran a hand through his already messy hair, a gesture of pure distress. "There's nothing to talk about. Nothing to talk about." I felt a surge of anger, hot and clean, cutting through the fog of my hurt. "You kiss me, you sleep in my bed, and then you tell me it was a mistake and vanish for a week, and you think there's nothing to talk about? Was our friendship that disposable to you?" That finally got him to look at me. His eyes were filled with a chaotic mix of emotions, guilt, fear, and something else, something that looked like desperation. "Of course not," he said, his voice cracking. "Leo, you're my best friend. That's why this is such a mess. I've ruined it. I've ruined everything." "You didn't ruin anything," I said, my voice softening slightly. "You just confused me. And you scared me. I don't know what I thought. But you owe me the truth. Why did you run? And what was a mistake? The kiss? Or running away?" He finally broke. A long, shuddering sigh escaped him, and he sank onto the edge of his couch, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook. "I don't know," he whispered, his voice muffled by his hands. "I don't know anything anymore. My whole life just fell apart, and you were the only thing that was stable, the only thing that made sense. And being with you, it felt right. It felt more right than anything has felt in a very long time. Lying there with you that night, it was the first time I'd felt peaceful in months. It was the first time I felt home." He lifted his head, and his eyes were glistening with unshed tears. "And that terrified me. Because it's you. You're Leo. You're my friend. This wasn't supposed to happen. It doesn't fit into any box. It's not part of the plan. And I kissed you. And for a second, everything was so clear. But then I woke up, and all I could think was, what have I done? I've dragged you into my chaos. I've taken your friendship and your kindness, and I've twisted it into something messy and selfish. The mistake wasn't the kiss, Leo." He looked at me then, his gaze direct and filled with a raw, painful honesty. "The mistake was panicking. The mistake was running away from the one good thing I had left." His confession hung in the air between us, a fragile, trembling thing. And in that moment, all my anger, all my hurt, dissolved, replaced by a wave of profound, aching empathy. He wasn't a monster. He wasn't cruel. He was just a man who was lost, scared, and grappling with a truth that had upended his entire understanding of himself. He hadn't run from me. He had run from his own feelings. And as I stood there in the wreckage of his apartment, looking at the man I loved at his most broken and his most honest, I knew that this wasn't the end. It was the difficult, messy, terrifying beginning. The honesty in Julian's voice, raw and unvarnished, acted as a strange sort of balm on my own wounded feelings. His confession didn't erase the pain of the past week, but it reframed it. He hadn't been running from me, but from a version of himself he no longer recognized. The kiss hadn't been a mistake. His fear had been. Understanding this shifted the ground beneath my feet. The anger and hurt receded, leaving behind a vast, quiet space filled with a tender, aching empathy. I saw him not as the source of my pain, but as someone in the throes of his own, grappling with a revelation that had shaken the very foundations of his identity. He had built his life on a blueprint of logic and expectation, and I, his quiet, steadfast friend, had suddenly appeared as an unforeseen and beautiful deviation he didn't know how to integrate. I crossed the small space between us and sat down on the coffee table in front of him, so we were at eye level. I didn't touch him. The space between us was still fragile, a newly forming bond that I was afraid to test too soon. I just held his gaze, letting him see the understanding in my eyes. I wanted him to know he wasn't alone in his fear. My own carefully ordered world had been thrown into chaos, too. "You didn't ruin anything, Julian," I said, my voice soft but sure. "You just changed the conversation. For a long time, we've been talking in a language that we both understood. Friendship. And then you started speaking a new one. And it was confusing, and I didn't know the words, and I was terrified of saying the wrong thing." I let out a small, humorless laugh. God, I was so scared. Every time you fell asleep on my couch, every time you reached for me, I was caught between hoping it meant everything and telling myself it meant nothing, just to protect myself. I took a deep breath, the confession feeling like a weight lifting from my own chest. That night, when you kissed me, it wasn't just you who felt like you were home. You have to know that. For me, it felt like a door I had been staring at my whole life had finally opened. And when you ran, it felt like you had slammed it shut and locked it from the other side. That's what hurt. Not the kiss. The silence. He listened, his eyes never leaving mine. The tears that had been welling finally spilled over, tracing clean paths through the stubble on his cheeks. He didn't wipe them away. It was as if he was too tired to maintain any pretense of being okay. I'm so sorry, Leo, he whispered, his voice thick. I'm so sorry I hurt you. I was drowning, and you were this solid shore, and I clung to you. But then I realized I didn't just want to be on the shore. I wanted more, and I didn't know what to do with that feeling. It didn't make any sense. With Sarah, it was easy. It was what everyone expected. It was the life I was supposed to want. But it never felt quiet. It never felt like peace. With you, in your apartment, with your hand in my hair, that was the quietest my head has been in years. He looked down at his hands again, turning them over as if they were foreign objects. I've spent my whole life building things with logic, with code. If this, then that. It's all cause and effect. But this, us, there's no logic to it. It just is. And it's the most real thing I've felt. That's what scared me. The reality of it. We sat in the quiet of his messy living room. The truth finally laid bare between us. The ambiguity that had been a source of so much tension and pain was gone, replaced by a terrifying and beautiful clarity. We were two men who had stumbled into a love we weren't prepared for, a love that defied the neat categories we had built for our lives. The conflict had never really been between us, but within us. It was his fear against his feelings, my hope against my history of self-preservation. Slowly, cautiously, I reached out and placed my hand over his. His skin was cool. He flinched, not out of panic this time, but out of surprise. Then he turned his hand over and laced his fingers with mine. His grip was tight, desperate, as if he were afraid I might vanish. It was the first time we had held hands while both fully awake and aware, and the simple, solid contact was more grounding than any words we could have spoken. It was an anchor in the storm. So what do we do now? He asked, his voice small, the question directed at our joined hands. I don't know, I admitted honestly, and it was a relief to say it. For once, I didn't have to have the answers. I didn't have to be the stable, solid one. We could be lost together. I guess we stop running. We stay. We figure it out. Slowly, I squeezed his hand. We could start by cleaning up this apartment. It's a disaster. A watery, hesitant smile touched his lips. It was the first real smile I had seen from him in a week, and it was like watching the sun break through the clouds. Yeah, he said, his voice a little stronger. Okay, we can do that. And so we did. We spent the rest of the afternoon bringing order to his chaos. I put on music, and we worked side by side, a comfortable, domestic rhythm falling into place between us. We gathered takeout containers, sorted laundry, washed dishes. We didn't talk much about what had happened. We didn't need to. The conversation was happening in the small gestures, the way he'd hand me a dish to dry, the way our shoulders would brush as we passed in the small kitchen, the way he would occasionally stop what he was doing just to look at me, a look of dawning wonder on his face. We were rebuilding, not just his apartment, but the foundation of our relationship, this time on the solid ground of honesty. As evening fell, casting long shadows across the newly cleaned living room, a familiar exhaustion settled over Julian. But it was a different kind of tired. It wasn't the frantic, anxious exhaustion of before, but a deep, peaceful weariness. We ordered a pizza and ate it sitting on the floor, leaning against the couch. I don't want you to go, he said quietly, when we were finished. I'm not going anywhere, I replied, the promise feeling solid and real in my mouth. That night, I stayed. When it was time for bed, there was no awkwardness, no hesitation. We walked to his bedroom together. He gave me a clean t-shirt, and we got into his bed as if we had been doing it for years. He turned to me in the darkness and pulled me close, tucking my head under his chin. Is this okay? He whispered into my hair, the echo of his first, terrifying question now transformed into a gesture of care, of consent. "It's more than okay," I whispered back, my voice thick with emotion. "It's everything." We lay there, and for the second time, I fell asleep in his arms. But this time, there was no fear of the morning. There was no dread. There was only the quiet, certain, and profoundly peaceful knowledge that I was finally, truly, home. The resolution wasn't a grand, cinematic moment. It was a slow, quiet dawn. It was the profound peace of finding a home in another person, a safe harbor built not on logic or expectation, but on the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. The door was no longer a barrier to be tentatively knocked upon, but a threshold we could now cross together, hand in hand. The ritual of the late-night visit was over, replaced by the simple, steady act of coming home.